The air in Pam Bondi's office, usually a crisp, sterile expanse of power and polished mahogany, felt thick with a low hum of unease. Sunlight glinting off the pristine glass of skyscrapers seemed to mock the shadow that had begun to creep into her carefully constructed world. It started with a murmur, a whisper carried on the wind of Capitol Hill gossip, a sound that, at first, she'd dismissed as the usual political detritus. But these whispers were different. They spoke of names, of secrets, of a shadow organization that reached into the highest echelons of power, and of files, damning files, that had been deliberately buried. Pam Bondi, Florida's former attorney general and a woman who had navigated the treacherous waters of state politics with the steely resolve of a seasoned captain, felt the first prickle of alarm. She was no stranger to controversy, to the relentless scrutiny of the media, to the venomous barbs of political opponents. But this felt larger. This felt like a different species of beast altogether. It began with a seemingly innocuous request from a congressional committee, a broad inquiry into federal prosecution records related to financial crimes. Bondi, now a senior figure within a powerful legal firm that served a clientele with considerable influence, had handled such requests before. They were procedural, often tedious, and rarely yielded anything more exciting than a dusty ledger. This time, however, the committee's interest seemed unnervingly specific. They were asking about a particular set of federal investigations that had, in years past, brushed against the periphery of a name that had become synonymous with scandal and whispered perversions: Jeffrey Epstein. The first official communication arrived not through the usual channels, but as a discreet, almost furtive email from a congressional aide. It was polite, almost apologetic in its tone, but the underlying demand was clear. They sought access to certain case files, specifically those related to Epstein's alleged co-conspirators in any ongoing investigations that might have been prematurely closed or inadequately pursued during Bondi's tenure as AG. Pam's legal team, a formidable unit of sharp minds and even sharper suits, had been briefed. They met in a hushed conference room, the scent of expensive coffee battling the faint metallic tang of anxiety. Richard Vance, her lead counsel, a man whose silver hair belied a razor-sharp intellect, spread out the congressional request. "They're fishing, Pam," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But they're fishing with a very specific hook." Pam, her gaze fixed on the document, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She knew the Epstein case, of course. Who in public life didn't? It was a festering wound on the national consciousness, a chilling reminder of the rot that could fester beneath the veneer of wealth and influence. But her office, during her time as AG, had not directly investigated Epstein. Their jurisdiction was state level. Federal matters were handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office. "We provided all relevant state records years ago," Pam stated, her voice steady, betraying none of the tremor she felt internally. "There's nothing new here." "That's what we'll tell them," Richard confirmed, tapping the paper with a manicured finger. "But they're pushing, hard. This isn't just a general request anymore. They're asking for unsealed grand jury testimony related to specific individuals who were either charged or investigated by federal authorities." The phrase hung in the air like a poisonous gas. Unsealed grand jury testimony. That was a thorny thicket. Federal grand juries operated under strict secrecy. The information gathered was almost never made public, protected by layers of legal injunctions and oaths of silence. To even inquire about such things suggested they had an inside track, a source with access to something. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified. The Congressional Committee, previously a distant entity, began to feel like a physical presence, its demands echoing in the corridors of Pam's new firm. There were phone calls, polite but persistent, from the committee's general counsel, a young, ambitious lawyer named Marcus Thorne, whose smooth voice was laced with an unsettling tenacity. "Ms. Bondi," Thorne would say, his tone carefully calibrated to convey respectful urgency, "we understand your office's scope at the time. However, our investigation has uncovered new information suggesting a possible intersection between state-level investigations and sensitive federal matters. We believe that a thorough review of your archives, specifically pertaining to any information shared with federal agencies or individuals who had dealings with Mr. Epstein, could be crucial. Pam, during these calls, felt a growing sense of unease. Thorne's language was vague, yet pregnant with implication. He spoke of sensitive federal matters and individuals who had dealings with Mr. Epstein, as if Pam should instinctively know what he meant. She didn't, or rather, she didn't want to. The truth was, she had encountered the Epstein orbit tangentially once, years prior, during a routine inquiry into a financial fraud case that had a fleeting connection to one of Epstein's known associates. The matter had been quickly resolved, the connection deemed insignificant, and the files had been duly archived, as was standard procedure. But Thorne's persistence suggested something more. He was implying not just a fleeting connection, but a deliberate suppression of information. One evening, as the city lights began to paint the skyline in hues of orange and purple, Pam found herself alone in her spacious office, the silence amplifying the thrumming in her ears. She scrolled through her personal files, her fingers brushing against memories of past victories and battles. She pulled up the records from her AG days, a vast digital archive of legal battles fought and won. She searched for Epstein and its associated names, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The results were sparse, as expected. Nothing that indicated any significant involvement beyond the tangential financial fraud case. Then, a notification pinged on her secure work laptop. An encrypted message from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "For your eyes only, Project Nightingale." Her instinct screamed caution. In the world of high-stakes law and politics, anonymous messages were rarely benign. But curiosity, that age-old human frailty, tugged at her. She opened the message. It contained a single hyperlink. Hesitantly, she clicked it. The link led to a secured, dark web portal. The page was minimalist, stark. A single password prompt. She tried a few common permutations, then a more obscure one she'd used for a particularly sensitive case. Nothing. Just as she was about to close the window, another message arrived, this time from a different anonymous source. A simple text message. The key is the silence. 41 seconds. 41 seconds. What did that mean? A timer? A code? It was cryptic, maddeningly so. She returned to the dark web portal, her mind racing. 41 seconds. She typed that into the password field. The portal sprang open. What she saw made her blood run cold. It was a directory, a sprawling, meticulously organized directory, filled with subfolders bearing names that sent a shiver down her spine. Names of prominent politicians, business tycoons, influential figures, all associated with Epstein, or at least with the shadowy network that had allegedly facilitated his crimes. And within these folders were document titles, cryptic yet chilling. Offshore accounts, JE Associates, victim testimony, unredacted, flight logs, Lolita Express. And then she saw it, a subfolder clearly labeled Florida AG, Bondi Investigations. Her hands trembled as she clicked it. Inside, she found not the sparse records she'd expected, but a list of internal memos, dated and stamped, detailing conversations and requests from federal agencies regarding Epstein. But the truly damning items were the exclusionary notes, each one referencing a specific file or piece of evidence that had been withheld from federal investigators. Each note bore a signature. Hers. Pam stared at the screen, a wave of nausea washing over her. These were not the innocuous records she remembered. These were files that indicated a deliberate refusal to cooperate, a conscious decision to keep certain information from federal authorities. The dates on these exclusionary notes coincided with periods when federal investigations into Epstein's network were actively ongoing. The sheer audacity, the calculated deception, left her reeling. She had been so focused on the surface-level inquiries, on the procedural aspects, that she had missed the deeper currents, the deliberate obfuscation. Had she been misled? Had she been a pawn in a larger game? Or had she, in some terrible lapse, made choices she couldn't even recall now? Suddenly, a loud, insistent ringing shattered the silence. Her office phone. It was Marcus Thorne. "Ms. Bondi?" His voice was smooth, unctuous, as if he'd just stepped out of a silk-lined vault. "I trust you've had time to consider our request. We've been advised by our sources that there are certain sensitive federal files within your firm's archives that directly pertain to the Epstein investigation. Files that were, shall we say, misplaced or inadvertently overlooked during your tenure as Attorney General." Pam's breath hitched. He knew. He knew. How could he know? "Mr. Thorne," she managed to say, her voice a tight wire, "I assure you, my office provided all relevant information to federal authorities years ago. There is nothing more to disclose." A beat of silence stretched, heavy with unspoken accusation. Then Thorne's voice dropped, losing its polite veneer, replaced by something colder, more menacing. "Ms. Bondi," he said, his words dripping with insinuation, "our committee has received substantial testimony suggesting that, specifically on date, a pivotal request for information regarding a confidential informant in the Epstein case was met with a deliberate and outright refusal. A refusal that, according to our sources, was directly authorized by you. And we have, shall we say, evidence of that refusal. Evidence that, if made public, would raise serious questions about your judgment, your integrity, and potentially, your complicity." Pam's blood ran cold. He was bluffing. He had to be. But the confidence in his voice, the chilling specificity of his veiled threat, felt terrifyingly real. "Complicity?" she whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "Let's just say," Thorne continued, his tone a silken threat, "that this committee has a very strong interest in ensuring that all relevant information, no matter how inconvenient, sees the light of day. And we are prepared to use all the tools at our disposal to achieve that, including, if necessary, initiating impeachment proceedings against any federal officials who are found to have obstructed justice." Pam stared at the glowing screen, at the list of files that seemed to condemn her. The anonymous message, the dark web portal, Thorne's insidious phone call. It was all converging, a perfect storm of accusation. She had refused something significant, something federal. And now the whispers had become shouts. The shadows had taken form, and the walls of her carefully constructed world were beginning to crack. The threat of impeachment, a phantom lurking in the political ether, had suddenly become a tangible, terrifying possibility. The game, she realized with a sickening lurch, had just begun. And she was already on the defensive. The flickering neon sign of a 24-hour diner cast a sickly glow on the rain-slicked street. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of stale coffee and desperation. Pam Bondi, her normally impeccable suit a little rumpled, stirred her lukewarm tea with a shaky hand. Across from her, a young aide, Liam, his face pale and drawn, fiddled with the sugar packets. "They're relentless, Liam," Pam murmured, her voice raspy. "Every phone call, every email. It's like a siege." Liam nodded, his eyes darting towards the diner's entrance as if expecting a SWAT team to breach it. "The committee, they're pushing hard. They want those files, Pam. The ones you flagged. The ones that mention names we're not supposed to know." Pam's jaw tightened. The memory of that sealed vault, the tantalizing glimpse of unredacted names and chilling implications, was seared into her mind. She had been the Attorney General of Florida then, a position of power and responsibility. And she had seen something that made her gut clench with a primal fear, a fear that had only amplified in the intervening years. Her refusal to hand over those specific documents, citing procedural loopholes and jurisdictional boundaries, had seemed like a strategic move at the time, a way to buy time, to understand the full scope of what she was dealing with. Now it felt like a noose tightening around her neck. "And they think I'm hiding something," Pam said, more to herself than to Liam. "That I'm complicit, that I'm protecting someone." "They're calling it obstruction of justice," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible. "And worse, on CNN they've been brutal. Senator Sterling is practically leading the charge." Senator Sterling. The name sent a fresh wave of unease through Pam. Sterling, a rising star in Congress, a self-proclaimed champion of transparency and justice, had been surprisingly aggressive in his pursuit of the Epstein files. Pam had met him once, at a legal conference. He'd struck her as ambitious, sharp, and utterly lacking in any moral compass that didn't align with his own trajectory. Now he was painting her as a villain, a symbol of government corruption. "Sterling's ambition is a dangerous thing, Liam," Pam said, her gaze hardening. "He's found his cause célèbre, and I'm his convenient scapegoat." "But why those files, Pam? What's in them that's so explosive?" Liam's question was direct, the same one that had been gnawing at him and at her for months. Pam took a slow breath. She couldn't tell him everything, not yet. The implications were too vast, the potential fallout too catastrophic, but she could give him a glimpse. "Imagine, Liam, a list of powerful people, people who were involved, not just with Epstein, with what he represented, with the dark underbelly of influence and exploitation that he preyed upon." Liam's eyes widened. "You mean politicians, judges, celebrities?" "And more," Pam said, her voice dropping to a low conspiratorial tone. "People whose names, if revealed, would shake the very foundations of our society. People who have spent their entire lives building carefully constructed images of respectability while living lives of unimaginable depravity." A shiver ran down Liam's spine. He'd heard whispers, of course, rumors that swirled in the political ether like toxic fog. But Pam Bondi, the former AG, the woman who had once stood on the precipice of revealing something truly monumental, was confirming them. "And you believe these specific files, are the key?" Liam asked, his voice trembling. "I believe they are a Pandora's box," Pam admitted. "And I hesitated. I hesitated because I didn't know who would be burned when it was opened. I didn't know if I was ready to be the one to light the match. But now they're forcing my hand." The digital age, a double-edged sword, had become Pam's greatest adversary. The internet, the very platform that could disseminate truth at lightning speed, was also a conduit for misinformation and character assassination. Anonymous sources, fueled by Sterling's relentless rhetoric, began to leak curated snippets of internal communications, carefully worded insinuations about Pam's alleged obstruction. One evening, as Pam was reviewing deposition transcripts in her dimly lit study, her phone buzzed. A private number. She hesitated, then answered. "Pamela," a smooth, chilling voice purred. It was Senator Sterling. "Senator," Pam replied, her voice carefully neutral. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Sterling chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Pleasure? I'm afraid this is far from pleasurable, Ms. Bondi. Not for you, at least. We're hearing disturbing things about your reluctance to cooperate with a federal investigation." Pam's stomach twisted. "My cooperation has been full and transparent, Senator, within the bounds of the law." "Ah, the law," Sterling drawled. "A convenient shield, isn't it? Especially when one has something to hide. We have sources, Pam, reliable sources who tell us you've been deliberately withholding crucial evidence that implicates powerful individuals." Pam's mind raced. Who were these sources? Had someone on her former team betrayed her? The thought was a cold dagger. "Senator, I assure you, that is not the case," Pam said, her voice firm, projecting an authority she didn't entirely feel. "The files you're referring to are part of an ongoing investigation, and their release is subject to specific legal protocols." "Protocols?" Sterling's voice rose, laced with a performative outrage. "The public has a right to know, Ms. Bondi. The public deserves to see the truth about who was involved with a monster like Epstein. And if you stand in the way of that truth, well, then perhaps Congress needs to consider the consequences." The implication hung heavy in the air. Impeachment. The word, spoken so casually, landed like a bomb. "Are you threatening me, Senator?" Pam's voice was a low growl, the veneer of civility cracking. "I'm stating facts, Ms. Bondi," Sterling said, his tone hardening. "The facts are, you are obstructing a vital investigation. And if that obstruction continues, there will be repercussions. You'll be hearing from us, through official channels, of course. The line went dead. Pam stared at her phone, her hand trembling. The psychological warfare had begun. Sterling wasn't just investigating, he was orchestrating a public trial by media, using leaks and veiled threats to paint her as guilty before any judgment could be rendered. The next few days were a blur of escalating pressure. Leaked documents, seemingly designed to insinuate Pam's complicity, began to surface online and in select media outlets. These weren't the unredacted files she was being accused of hiding, but rather carefully chosen internal memos, emails, and witness statements, twisted and presented out of context to create a narrative of her being a willing participant in a cover-up. One particular leak, posted on a prominent political blog known for its sensationalism, was a memo detailing Pam's initial review of the Epstein files. It highlighted her concerns about the sensitive nature of certain individuals' involvement and her recommendations for enhanced privacy protocols. The blog's headline screamed, "Bondi's cover-up, AG knew all along, tried to bury it." Pam felt physically ill. The memo was factual, but the spin was poisonous. She had flagged those names because they were explosive, not because she wanted to hide them, but because she wanted to understand the ramifications of their exposure. She had envisioned a carefully considered strategy for disclosure, one that minimized collateral damage while ensuring justice. Sterling, however, saw only an opportunity for destruction. On the evening news, CNN's most vocal pundit, a man with a perpetually grim expression and a booming voice, declared, "Senator Sterling is absolutely right. The American people deserve to know the full truth about the Epstein network. And if Pam Bondi is standing in the way of that truth, then she is no better than the criminals she's supposed to be prosecuting. The call for impeachment is not only justified, it is imperative." Pam watched the segment, a cold dread settling in her stomach. She saw her face flash across the screen, a freeze frame of her looking stern during a press conference. The implication was clear. She was a criminal, a conspirator, an enemy of justice. Liam, who had been monitoring the media coverage with a growing sense of horror, burst into her office. "Pam, they're not just reporting anymore. They're accusing. Sterling is on every network, hammering the same points. They're making it sound like you actively helped Epstein." "It's a campaign, Liam," Pam said, her voice weary but resolute. "A carefully orchestrated smear campaign. They want to break me. They want to force me to hand over the files, not to reveal the truth, but to create chaos, to destabilize, to destroy careers." "But why those specific names, Pam?" Liam's question, though repeated, held a new urgency, a desperate plea for understanding. Who are they, that their exposure would be this catastrophic? Pam looked out the window at the darkening sky, the city lights blurring through her tired eyes. She couldn't tell him, not yet. The weight of that knowledge was a burden she carried alone. But she knew, with a chilling certainty, that she was no longer just defending her reputation. She was defending something far larger. She was defending the fragile integrity of institutions, the possibility of a justice that wasn't driven by political expediency, but by truth. "Liam," she said, turning back to her aide, her eyes filled with a steely resolve. "They think they can break me with leaks and threats. They think they can corner me. But they don't understand. They've underestimated me. And they've underestimated the power of what I'm protecting." A sudden, sharp notification on her laptop jolted them both. A new article, from a source she didn't recognize, but with a chillingly familiar tone. It wasn't just about her refusal to hand over files anymore. It was about why. It hinted at a secret deal, a quid pro quo, a shadowy agreement made years ago. The headline was a gut punch. "Bondi's deal with the devil. What did Florida's AG trade for silence?" Pam's breath hitched. The dam was breaking, and the flood that was about to be unleashed was unlike anything she had ever imagined. The carefully constructed walls of her past were crumbling, piece by piece, under the relentless barrage of manufactured outrage and calculated deception. The psychological cliffhanger wasn't just for the public watching the drama unfold. It was for Pam herself, as she braced for the full, terrifying force of the storm she had inadvertently helped to unleash. The vindication she craved felt impossibly distant, lost somewhere in the churning waters of accusations and betrayal. The only certainty was the relentless, escalating pressure and the gnawing fear of what would be left standing when the deluge finally subsided. The air in Pam Bondi's sparsely decorated office felt thicker than usual, heavy with unspoken accusations and the metallic tang of fear. Sunlight, usually a welcome visitor, now seemed to cast harsh, accusatory shadows across the polished mahogany desk. She sat there, a statue carved from granite, her face a mask of forced composure. Across from her, her chief of staff, Mark, fidgeted with a stack of papers, his usual brisk demeanor replaced by a nervous tremor. "They're calling me a collaborator, Pam," Mark finally choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "On national television. They're saying I sat on this for you, that I actively helped you bury it." Pam didn't flinch. Her gaze remained fixed on a point beyond Mark, lost in a battlefield of her own making. "And what did they say about me, Mark?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Everything, worse than you can imagine. They're painting you as the architect of the cover-up, the one who brokered the deal, the one who traded justice for... Well, they don't even have a concrete accusation for what you gained, but they imply it was something colossal." He gestured wildly with the papers, his frustration finally bubbling over. "This is insanity. We did our jobs, we followed protocol. The investigation was handled by the proper channels. We weren't obligated to hand over everything to a congressional committee that was clearly looking for blood, not truth." Pam finally turned her attention to him. Her eyes, usually a piercing blue, now held a weary glint. "Protocol, Mark. Such a comforting word when it aligns with our narrative. But protocol didn't stop the whispers, did it? It didn't stop the anonymous sources from spewing venom. And it certainly didn't stop CNN from creating a spectacle." The specter of the CNN segment hung in the air like a poisonous fog. The aggressive reporter, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, her face a picture of righteous fury, had delivered a blistering indictment. The segment, clipped and replayed endlessly online, had been a masterclass in political theater. 41 seconds. That's all it took. 41 seconds from Pam's terse, prepared statement confirming she had no further comment on the Epstein files, to Jenkins' triumphant pronouncement that sources close to the congressional inquiry confirmed that the Florida Attorney General's office deliberately withheld crucial evidence in the Jeffrey Epstein case, a move that has now prompted immediate calls for impeachment. Impeachment. The word echoed in Pam's mind, a jarring dissonance against the quiet hum of her office. "They manufactured this, Pam," Mark pleaded, his voice raw. Jenkins spun a narrative. "They took your standard response, a response we rehearsed a dozen times, and twisted it into a confession of guilt." "And why did we give her a standard response, Mark?" Pam's voice was laced with a steely edge. "Because we knew this was coming. Because we knew there were powerful forces at play who saw these files as their own personal undoing. And because, somewhere along the line, someone decided that maintaining the status quo, that protecting certain reputations, was more important than uncovering the full truth." A psychological cliffhanger. That's what this had become. The public, fed a diet of sensationalism and outrage, was hungry for a villain. And Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, now a private citizen, was being meticulously sculpted into that role. The narrative was simple, yet devastating. Bondi, complicit, protected powerful men, and obstructed justice. The truth, however, was a complex tapestry woven with threads of political maneuvering, legal gray areas, and the crushing weight of institutional pressure. Pam knew, with a chilling certainty, that the initial decision to stonewash the most explosive elements of the Epstein investigation, while legally defensible, was a political minefield. She had argued fiercely that a state-level investigation, with its limited scope and jurisdiction, was not equipped to handle the intricate web of international connections and powerful figures implicated. She had advocated for deferring to federal authorities, for allowing the FBI and DOJ to take the lead. But the pressure to resolve the case, to present a clean, decisive victory, had been immense. And in the end, a compromise had been struck, a carefully curated version of justice delivered. "They're not just threatening impeachment anymore, Pam. Mark said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. There are inquiries from other states. They're digging into old cases, anything that remotely smells of impropriety. Pam closed her eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. She had anticipated this. The attackers, as she mentally categorized them, were not about to let this opportunity slip away. They had pushed, they had exposed, and now, seeing her cornered, they were tightening the noose. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity. Law offices, once a sanctuary, became battlegrounds. Pam's legal team worked around the clock, sifting through mountains of documents, preparing counter-arguments, and strategizing against an unseen enemy. The internet, a double-edged sword, became a constant source of torment and, paradoxically, a tool for dissemination. Every tweet, every blog post, every YouTube commentary channel amplified the accusations, painting Pam as a pariah. One evening, while reviewing a particularly damning online article, Pam stumbled upon a leaked internal memo. It was from a congressional staffer, outlining a strategy to leverage the Bondi case to exert pressure on Floridian law enforcement and political figures who may have been complicit. The memo detailed a plan to orchestrate media narratives, leak selective information, and create an atmosphere of public distrust to force compliance with their investigations. The sheer Machiavellian nature of it made her stomach churn. They orchestrated this, Mark, she said, her voice trembling with a cold fury as she shoved the laptop across the desk. This wasn't just a reaction to our actions. This was a pre-planned demolition. Mark's eyes widened as he scanned the document. This changes everything. This shows intent. This shows they were out to get you, not just uncover facts. And the 41 seconds, Mark? Pam asked, her gaze fixed on him. The 41 seconds that became the rallying cry for the entire impeachment circus. This memo explains it. It was the perfect hook. A simple, undeniable snippet of time, presented as evidence of deliberate obstruction. The leak of the memo was a double-edged sword. It confirmed Pam's worst fears about a targeted attack, but it also provided a crucial piece of exculpatory evidence. Her legal team immediately seized upon it, using it to bolster their defense and to begin an offensive of their own, subtly leaking counter-narratives to select journalists. The attackers, however, were not easily deterred. The Congressional Committee, sensing a shift in the narrative, doubled down. They released edited transcripts, cherry-picked testimony, and continued to bombard the media with inflammatory rhetoric. Sarah Jenkins, the CNN reporter, became the de facto spokesperson for the anti-Bondi movement, her segments growing longer, more aggressive, and more self-righteous with each passing day. One night, Pam received a cryptic call. The voice on the other end was muffled, hesitant. "Ms. Bondi," the voice whispered, I have information about the deal, the one that kept certain names out of the files." Pam's heart leaped. This was it, the breaking point. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice tight with anticipation. "I can't say, but I worked on the periphery. I saw things that were hidden, things that were suppressed." The voice grew fainter. "There was a conversation, a phone call, between someone in your office and someone very powerful. It wasn't about justice, it was about damage control." The call ended abruptly. Pam was left with a phantom lead, a tantalizing glimpse into the heart of the conspiracy, but no solid ground to stand on. The psychological cliffhanger had morphed into an ever-widening chasm of uncertainty. As the impeachment threats escalated, so did the pressure on Pam's former colleagues. One by one, under intense scrutiny and the threat of their own professional ruin, key figures from her former administration began to crumble. They offered selective testimonies, painting a picture of a compromised decision-making process, subtly shifting blame away from themselves and towards Pam. It was a betrayal, raw and brutal, that cut deeper than any public accusation. Mark, his face etched with exhaustion and worry, brought her a report one morning. "They've got the former chief investigator. He's cooperating. He's testifying that you personally instructed him to redact certain sensitive information." Pam stared at the report, a hollow ache spreading through her chest. The former chief investigator, a man she had personally mentored, a man whose integrity she had believed in implicitly. "He's lying, Mark," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I know, Pam, but they've got him, and his testimony, combined with the leaked memo and Jenkins' relentless coverage, it's creating a tidal wave." The attackers had achieved their objective. The narrative had solidified. Pam Bondi, the defender of justice, was now the accused, the villain in a national drama. The tension reached its zenith during a televised congressional hearing. Pam, under oath, faced a barrage of aggressive questioning. The lawmakers, armed with their carefully constructed narrative, probed and prodded, their voices laced with condemnation. Sarah Jenkins, in the front row, scribbled furiously in her notepad, her eyes burning with an almost fanatical intensity. "Ms. Bondi," a particularly aggressive congressman boomed, "did you or did you not order the redaction of documents pertaining to Jeffrey Epstein's alleged financial transactions with prominent figures?" Pam met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "Congressman, my office followed established legal protocols. The scope of our investigation was limited, and we deferred to federal authorities on matters falling outside our jurisdiction." "Deferral, Ms. Bondi?" Another chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or a deliberate stonewall? 41 seconds, Ms. Bondi. That's all it took for you to refuse to cooperate. 41 seconds that crippled a federal investigation, according to our sources." Pam's jaw tightened. She could feel the room closing in, the weight of millions of eyes on her. But then something shifted. As the questions grew more pointed, more accusatory, a subtle change rippled through the hearing room. A figure, previously unnoticed, rose from the back and approached the dais. It was an older gentleman, his face deeply lined, his suit impeccably tailored. He held a single, thin file. He approached the lead interrogator, a man whose face was currently contorted in a triumphant sneer. "Excuse me, Congressman," the old man said, his voice surprisingly resonant, cutting through the tense atmosphere. "May I present this?" The congressman, momentarily taken aback, nodded curtly. The old man opened the file, revealing a single, unsigned document. "This," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the microphones, "is a sworn affidavit from a former FBI agent who was tasked with overseeing the Epstein case at the federal level. It details, with explicit clarity, a direct communication from a senior official within the Department of Justice, explicitly advising your committee to refrain from publicizing the existence of certain Epstein files, pending a broader federal investigation." A stunned silence fell over the room. The carefully constructed narrative began to fray at the edges. The congressman's face, a moment before flushed with self-importance, turned ashen. The old man continued, his voice gaining strength. "Furthermore," he said, pulling another document from the file, "this is a transcript of a recorded phone call between a senior aide to a powerful senator and a journalist at a major news network. The conversation clearly outlines a strategy to create a media firestorm around any perceived obstruction, specifically targeting, shall we say, individuals with prior political aspirations, to ensure their silence and to create a smokescreen for the real culprits." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, landing on Sarah Jenkins, who had gone deathly pale. The 41 seconds, Congressman, were not a sign of obstruction. They were a prearranged signal, a signal that the political machinations were in motion and that the narrative was about to be dictated. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The aggressive posture of the attackers, their meticulously crafted accusations, began to unravel in real time. The power dynamics, so carefully balanced, were violently overturned. The attackers were exposed, not as righteous investigators, but as manipulators, using a tragedy to settle political scores and protect their own interests. Sarah Jenkins, the aggressive reporter, visibly wilted under the scrutiny. Her confident pronouncements were now exposed as the result of carefully curated leaks and a predetermined agenda. Her collapse wasn't a dramatic fall, but a quiet, mortifying implosion, as the credibility she had built on sensationalism crumbled around her. The impeachment threats, once a potent weapon, now sounded hollow, desperate. The public, witnessing this dramatic reversal, began to question the motives of the congressional committee. The carefully constructed image of Pam Bondi as the villain began to shift. She was no longer the architect of a cover-up, but a pawn, caught in a far larger, more sinister game. In the aftermath, the fallout was swift and brutal. The congressional committee, facing an unprecedented scandal, was forced to launch its own internal investigation. The senior DOJ official implicated in the affidavit was suspended, and the powerful senator's aide was fired. The narrative, so carefully crafted, had been irrevocably shattered. Pam Bondi, no longer the target of a public onslaught, found herself on a path to vindication. The legal battles continued, but the tide had turned. The leaked memo, the affidavit, and the recorded phone call provided irrefutable evidence of a conspiracy against her. She emerged from the ordeal, not unscathed, but certainly not defeated. The experience had forged her into something stronger, more resilient. The relentless attacks had exposed the rot at the heart of the political system, and in doing so, had inadvertently cleared her name. Weeks later, Pam sat in her quiet, sun-drenched office, the mahogany desk now gleaming with a renewed sense of peace. Mark entered, a genuine smile finally gracing his lips. "They're dropping the investigations, Pam," he said, his voice filled with relief. "All of them. The media is starting to tell a different story, the one about a woman who stood her ground against a rigged game." Pam nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She picked up a framed photograph from her desk. It was an old picture, taken years ago, of her standing confidently on a stage, addressing a cheering crowd. The glint in her eyes was the same, that determined, unwavering spirit. "It wasn't about the 41 seconds, Mark," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It was about what they feared might be revealed in those 41 seconds and the subsequent days. They feared the truth, and the truth, in the end, has a way of finding its own light." The experience had been a crucible. She had been targeted, attacked, and pushed to the brink. But she had remained resilient, weathering the storm with unwavering resolve. Now, vindicated, she looked out at the horizon, not with apprehension, but with the quiet strength of someone who had stared into the abyss and emerged, not just alive, but with a profound understanding of the shadows that lurked beneath the surface of power. The unraveling had begun, and Pam Bondi, no longer a pawn but a survivor, was ready to face whatever came next.